Hello and welcome back to my twice weekly videos dealing with Torah life and Jewish life. I hope you're enjoying them. Today is a very auspicious day. It is the 12th day of the month of Tammuz, and the 12th day of the month of Tammuz is celebrated by Jewish people all over the world as the anniversary of the liberation of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Joseph Isaac Schneerson, the Rebbe's father-in-law, from communist prison in 1927. And it has a significance not just to Hasidim, not just to Chabad, but to everybody in the world. Because ultimately, the entire world has changed as a result of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. Through his influence and his activities, there are Chabad centers all over the world now, and his influence is felt in every corner of the world. So let's talk a little bit about him. He lived during a difficult time. This was the early period of the Soviet Union, of communism. It was during the Stalinist period, which saw tremendous persecution of Jews. We remember the doctor's plot, where literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people were killed and were sent to the Gulag, sent to the harsh prisons in Siberia. It was a very difficult time. Religion was more than frowned upon. Religion was outlawed, even though, according to the Soviet constitution, there was supposed to be freedom of religion, but in reality, there wasn't. And the synagogues were closed, schools were closed, mikvahs were closed, and rabbis were sentenced to death. Many rabbis were executed. Many Jews tried to flee Russia as best as they could. Many of the great yeshivas, Torah academies of Russia were closed and relocated to other places like America or Israel. Some of the great Torah academies left during that time. Yeshivas such as Hebron and Slobodka and Mir. So many of these yeshivas of Volozhin, Vilna, and um, and and religious life was persecuted tremendously. People were afraid to go to synagogue. They were afraid not to send their children to school on Shabbos during these difficult times. And the number one targets of the Soviets were the rabbis. The rabbis were the ones who directed these activities. Most of the rabbis, as I mentioned, left because their lives were in danger. Rabbi Schneerson, however, did not leave. In fact, Rabbi Schneerson doubled down on his activities as never before. As a result, in June 16th of 1927, he was arrested. He was informed on by the Jewish section of the Communist Party, which was a prominent part of the Soviet Union at that time. It was called the Yevsektia, or the Jewish section. And members of the Yevsektia, um, they informed on him to the authorities, and they themselves came and arrested him. It was a case of Jewish anti-Semitism at its very worst. He was sentenced to originally to death, and then to life imprisonment, and it was a very harsh sentence. He was imprisoned in Leningrad, which St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad at that time. He was tortured by the communists. He was threatened by them, and for 17 days he was in prison. Till, because of tremendous pressure brought on by American Jews and European Jews during that time, the Soviets sent him to exile in central Russia in a place called Kostroma, which was a common place far off to send exiles to. In fact, it's interesting, today there is a Chabad house in Kostroma. I don't know how many Jews live there, but it's far, far away. On the 13th of Tammuz, he was notified of his release, and he left. It was quite a remarkable story. It was a story of heroism. Eventually, in 1940, he left Russia for good and moved to New York, to Israel, to New York, where he established his base of operations. And 10 years later, his father-in-law, his son-in-law, his illustrious son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, took over the reins of the Chabad movement on his demise. It's quite a story, a remarkable story of heroism and of fortitude, of strength, and it was really a remarkable thing. Hasidim especially take tremendous values of him. Tremendous, they look at him in in a very great way. And indeed, these are days of celebration, and we make farbrengens. In fact, tonight and Tuesday night, we're having a big farbrengen at Chabad University City. Everyone's welcome to attend. If you have heard this message already, we look forward to hearing you. We're going to be watching a video of the Rebbe of Soviet Jews and Russian Jewry at that farbrengen. And I'd like to read for you a remarkable article. In 1930, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, left Russia for a trip. He went to what was then Palestine, Israel, and then he went to various communities in Europe, and then he ended up in America, and he traveled around to a number of cities in America, and then eventually he went back to Russia for another 10 years before he left permanently and came to America for good. So when he came to one of the cities he visited was the city of Baltimore in 1930. And the Baltimore Sun, which was a prominent newspaper then, I don't know if it still is, wrote as follows. Rabbi Schneerson is 50 years old. So he was born in 1880. He took over from his father, Rabbi Shalom Ber Schneerson, who was the Rebbe before him, who was the fifth Rebbe of Chabad. And when Rabbi Shalom Ber, or we call him the Rashab, passed away, his son, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, took over. Anyways, the article in the Baltimore Sun reads as follows. Rabbi Schneerson is 50 years old. This is in 1930. He is of medium height with heavy beard, once red, but now with graying streaks. His kindly eyes gleam from under his broad, round black hat. The year was 1930. Soviet Jewry lay under threat of its existence. 6 months earlier, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Isaac Schneerson, had been on an extended trip, first to the Holy Land, then to the U.S. Traveling across the country, he described in great pain the difficult conditions of the Jews in communist Russia. So this was an article that appeared in the Baltimore Sun the day after the Rebbe's arrival in that city, where thousands came out to greet him and describe the Rebbe's work and details of his visit. So the article says as follows from the Baltimore Sun, January 13th, 1930. Religious Jews in Russia are grateful in the Soviets, I guess the Soviet Union, because the government has consistently repressed anti-Jewish pogroms. Now, during that time, before that time, anti-Jewish pogroms were very common throughout Russia. But one thing that the Soviet regime did was stop them. Rabbi Shmaryahu Garari, son-in-law and spokesman for Rabbi Isaac Schneerson, famous Jewish leader, said last night, Rabbi Garari spoke in Yiddish, which was translated by Rabbi Adolf Koblnitz of Chizuk Emunah congregation, which is still in existence today. In the afternoon, more than 3,000 Jews welcomed Rabbi Schneerson when he arrived at Mount Royal Station. This was the train station. An automobile parade of hundreds of cars escorted the rabbi to his temporary Baltimore residence at 2343 Utah Place in Baltimore, where he was welcomed with Jewish songs and ceremonies. Rabbi Schneerson, who was born in Russia and has spent practically his whole life there, leaving in 1928 after a term of imprisonment because of his activities as a leader in the organization of Russian Jewish religious schools. Now, Rabbi Schneerson left Russia in 1928, and he moved to Riga, which was in Latvia, even though Latvia at that time was also part of the Soviet Union, but I guess it was less repressive, and it was easier to function as a Jew there in Riga. The article in the Baltimore Sun continues. During his 2-month stay in the United States, the rabbi will enlighten the people of the United States as to the actual condition of Jewish life in Soviet Russia and how these conditions can be improved in accordance with the policy and legislation of Soviet government, which is anti-religious. However, as I mentioned, it was still legal to practice religion in Russia. The second factor which interests the rabbi is the raising of funds to aid in the support of schools and academies he and his late father, Rabbi Shalom Schneerson, founded during their 37 years of religious educational work in Poland, Lithuania, Palestine, and other places. So one of the purposes of his trip was to raise funds for these schools. It was on June the 16th, 1927, that the rabbi was arrested. After being held for 17 days, he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in Kostroma, central Russia, for his religious work. He was released only when Jews from every part of Europe and America petitioned the government for his release. He was given his freedom, and permission was granted to leave the land, which he did early in 1928, taking up his residence in Riga, Latvia. From there, he directed his religious work. Prior to the advent of the Soviet regime, Russia was the scene of numerous anti-Jewish outbreaks. You remember Fiddler on the Roof and what it was like about that. In spite of the elimination of these persecutions, however, Rabbi Gorari, the Rebbe's son-in-law, said the economic status of religious Jews in Russia at this time is deplorable. We can only imagine what religious life was like during that time. Since the Tsarist regime forbade the Jews the ownership of land, their energies were directed along other channels, most of the Jews becoming merchants and traders. Since the Soviet policy is adverse to individual trading, after all, it was a communist regime, everything was government owned. Naturally, the 3 million Jews who lived in Russia at that time depended primarily on commerce for their subsistence. Is hard hit, the rabbi said. Some turned to industry, and many Jews actually who were able to had factories. And the communist government encouraged it because they needed the industry. A small number of Jews have turned to industry, while others have found employment in government offices and factories. However, the latter are mostly unorthodox Jews who are more welcome to the Soviets than those who are tenaciously cling to the faith of their fathers, the educator asserted. Industry, it was said, is the natural outlet because through industrial life, religious conditions can be ameliorated in conformity with the laws of the land. It was easier to be a religious Jew if you owned a factory than if you had a store, or if you're a teacher or something like that. It is this desire to cooperate with the government as far as their attitude towards Jewish religion is concerned, and to learn how to adapt their religion so it fits within the category and law laid down by the Soviets that the Jews are working towards. We can only imagine what life must have been like during that time. Rabbi Schneerson is 50 years old. He is, we mentioned before, throughout the afternoon and evening, he welcomed, this is in Baltimore, he welcomed members of both Orthodox and Reformed Jewish congregations. They all came to see him. He was a very illustrious rabbi who came to town, and representatives of various Jewish organizations. Greeted in New York, he first came to New York. After leaving Riga some months ago, he went to Palestine, Germany, and France before coming to America. In New York, he was greeted by thousands of Jews from all over the country and an official welcoming committee on a tugboat appointed by Mayor James J. Walker of New York. The rabbi comes from a long line of rabbis who have been active in Russian Jewry for the last 150 years. He is the lineal descendant of the rabbi of Liadi, who we call the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman, who lived 150 years ago and who was one of the founders of the Hasidic movement in Russia. The movement was the expression of renewed form of the age-old mystic yearnings of the Jewish people. It talks about the Rav of Liadi became the founder of this dynasty, the spiritual leader to which many, many people flocked from all over Europe for guidance, comfort, and inspiration. Rabbi Gorari, the Rebbe's son-in-law, comes from one of the wealthiest landed Jewish families in Russia, where under the old regime, the Tsarist regime that is, it owned large holdings in Odessa and Kamishikuk. The rabbi and his party will remain in Baltimore for 2 weeks. He was welcomed to Maryland by Mayor Thomas McNicholson, who represented the governor. The rabbi, through an interpreter, expressed his appreciation and reception and sympathy shown him in this country since his arrival 2 months ago. It talks about some of the various dignitaries that came to see him, congressional representatives, city hall representatives, representatives of the governor and of the mayor's office, etc. He said delegations from New York and Philadelphia, where the Rebbe had spoken, accompanied him. It must have been a tremendous event for him to come and for all these important people to come and see him. A municipal reception is planned for Thursday at City Hall, where he will be received by the mayor of Baltimore. It was a representative crowd that gathered at the station that greeted him over there. Now, continuing a little bit further, a tremendous throng when he came and he descended from the train after a few minutes, during which time he was officially welcomed to the city. A long procession of automobiles drove out to the Mount Royal Avenue to where the Rebbe was staying to greet him. Finally, he was led to his private quarters on the second floor, where he began meeting delegations of Jews, where he shortly afterwards started his work. Throughout the remainder of the afternoon and evening, however, hundreds of Jews came to see the Rebbe. It was a tremendous event. It was a historical event in the city of Baltimore. In addition to that, during his American trip, as we said, the Rebbe came first to New York. He went to Philadelphia. He also went to St. Louis and to Chicago. And he started establishing schools in areas such as those places. And to this day, these communities have very old Chabad communities in these places. The Rebbe was actually credited with the beginning of the day school movement in America. He saw that in America, it's not going, yeshivas in the old style were not going to be so popular among more of the American Jews. So he established a day school movement where they would teach secular studies as well as Judaic studies. And this concept caught on. And indeed, today, the vast majority of Jewish day schools are in that model. And they're really representative from the previous Rebbe. Other rabbis took the lead and encouraged also the establishment of these schools. The Torah Masorah movement got started as a result of that as well. So the Rebbe's influence was tremendously felt to this day. As I said, that after a while, the Rebbe went back to Riga, and when he saw that it was just too difficult to act there, he realized that Jewish life, active Jewish life in Russia at that time, was going downhill. So he moved to America in 1940. His son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, shortly followed him afterwards, I believe in 1941, 1942. And the Chabad movement started in America. Interestingly, today we have Chabad all over Russia. In every nook and cranny, every town and city and village in Russia, there is Chabad today. There's a tremendous resurgence of Jewish life in Russia, as there is throughout the world. And this also can be accredited to the work, the remarkable work of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. So we want to celebrate this day by Farbrengens, by making l'chaim to everyone, and we'll see you again on Friday.